recording. So this should be capturing this, hopefully, because this is a pretty complex lecture today. The other thing is I am currently broadcasting on WebEx if you want to log into that. Again, I know it's been a long break. If you're forgetting where that's at, ETSU E3, DIGM classes, Greg, and it's this WebEx link right there. I wonder what that is. I'll have to watch that later. If you want to go ahead and pull that down or double click on that, it should open up in a browser and you can follow along with what's on screen. Before we get moving too far on this, this is the robot I'm going to be working on today. It's the one I've used in past lectures too. I know some of you didn't do a robot. That's okay. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But before we go too much further, I wanted to look really quickly at our schedule just to see where we are. That's us right there, 11/26/18. Let me scroll down there where you can see it. So we have about, 3 weeks from today, right? 2 weeks from today, really. So a week from today, Monday the 3rd, and you all chose the early final date, so a week from there, the 10th, that's when this will be due. What my plan is today and next class period to go over the last 2 lectures of class. One of them is rigging the robot, the other one is animating the robot. I think we can get through rigging the robot today for the most part. If something goes haywire, we can push animating the robot off until Monday. I will say rigging is complicated, and I just wasted half of class trying to get this computer to work and getting here late. So if we don't get through it today, it's okay. But we're going to at least get started. So the only other thing I would say, I've started on the grading the rest of what you've turned in. There's one thing I'm going to wait for a little while on grading. I think I have it marked as the 10th is when the final replies are due for the post on D2L, for the discussion board. I went and checked that out, and a lot of you have commented on that. The deadline to get full credit on that was a couple of days ago, like the 19th. So hopefully everybody in here has actually started that discussion on D2L. If not, jump on there anyway and start posting, and hopefully I can at least give you partial credit on that. I'm seeing some pretty interesting conversations happening there, so that's awesome. Okay, so what we're going to, any questions about the rest of the semester, about what the plan is? The plan is pretty much to finish up this project. I will also say, I know there's a handful of revisions in the submissions folder, and I'll be looking at those as well, but if you haven't submitted revisions yet, feel free to keep working on those and keep updating those. That's one of the last things I do at the end of the semester is check the revisions folder one more time, and then I put in the extra credit work for a portfolio review, which will be happening next week if you weren't able to make it to the first one. So I'll get you the dates on that pretty soon. But I believe it's going to be Thursday and Friday. Okay. So this is my robot. I'm actually working on a different robot as well, just for funsies. I know a lot of you didn't do a robot. How many of you did something that was not a robot? Okay. The reason I encouraged you all to do a robot is this. If I select any part of this, it's a separate piece, right? And that's a good thing in terms of skinning, right? We have this hull, this shell, and that's going to be a little bit easier to skin than, say, this piece right here, which is all one piece of mesh that has to deform, right? And it has to deform at a very specific spot. So we'll talk about this a little bit here in a minute. Let me go ahead and hide my ground plane just to get that out of our way. And because of the way I'm going to do this, I'm actually not going to rig the skirt. Sort of you can rig the skirt, but sort of as an afterthought, what I was going to do is just add an in-cough deformer to that, or an in-cough simulation to that, and let it just sort of flap around. So I'm just going to go ahead and hide that. So this is the main part of what I'm rigging on my robot. If you have a character that's not a robot, it's all one piece, that's okay. It just means that certain steps of this are going to be a little more complicated for you because you have to do more painting of the skin weights. We'll talk about what that means as we go along here. How many of you did something with more than 2 legs? How many of you did something with some arms or a head or like extra bobbly bits? Okay. I'm going to cover rigging this. Okay. This is what the assignment was for 2 legs. So in class, what I'm going to lecture about is how to get this rigged, right? That means if you have more than that, you probably should ask for some advice from me during some of the work days in class on how to get your rig to work. So for example, and I'll give you some clues as we're going along here, but that just means you're going to have extra skeletal parts on this character that you have to figure out how yours will work. The other thing is some people sometimes do a leg that is not similar to a human leg. So for example, this is the grease pencil. It'll allow you to kind of sketch in your viewport here. I'll just show you, like our leg right now, like a human leg, has your upper leg, your lower leg, then this is where your ankle is, right? And then you kind of have to the ball of your foot and then the toe of your foot, right? And there's, like, in real life, there's a little bit of a bone that's back here too, but really this is what a human leg looks like. Maybe someone did something that has a leg similar to like a horse's leg or a dog's leg, which looks a little different. It looks like it's bent backwards, right? And really it's not. What's really happening is that all of this is shifted up. Like a dog's leg is more like this, right? Which means this point right here is actually coinciding with this point up here, not down here, right? And so really all that's happened is over time in evolution, our heel has lowered, or other creatures, I have no idea, I'm not a scientist. Other creatures' heels have raised, I don't know. And so dogs are kind of like walking around on their tiptoes all the time. So don't worry about that. It's actually a similar rigging process, but these are all questions that everybody in the class is going to have different questions and run into different problems. That's why I make these open-ended projects. I don't force you to model or do a very specific thing and walk through it. It's because I want you all to learn something different. Like you're all going to become different artists as you go along. So, okay. So before we jump into rigging this character, I'm going to open up a separate Maya file, and we're going to talk about the type of deformer we're going to use, which is a skeleton or a joint deformer. So feel free to kind of follow along with this part if you want, just to see how this works. I'm going to make a cylinder, or follow along with any of it. Height, put some subdivisions in there, actually. So you all will remember when we were working with other deformers, like the bottle animation, we put a couple of different deformers on it. Who can remember what they were? So we had a bend deformer. Anybody remember another one that we did?
Stretch?
Yeah, it's a squash. I think it's either a squash and stretch or yeah, you're right though. Deformers are just a way of manipulating the individual vertices on a model in a specific way, right? So, for example, if we did that bend deformer that we did before, it's under nonlinear, right? Bend. Right? Oh, wait, I had both of them selected, didn't I? Let's just do one. Deformer, nonlinear, bend. I add some curvature to that, right? All this deformer is doing is manipulating each of these individual vertices in a procedural way, right? I could have gotten this same thing by going in there to vertex mode and manipulating them and bending them into this shape. But what is happening is instead this deformer is taking all of those vertices and sort of curving them, right? So a deformer is just manipulating an object on the vertex level, right? Or on the sub-object level, on the component level. So that's important to remember because that means the number of vertices or the orientation of all of your vertices is going to determine how it bends, right? We remember, hopefully, that if I select this object here, which is just one polygon tall, like the only vertices in this is on the top and on the bottom, if I add that bend deformer to this, right, I get something really messed up, right? Because there's nothing to bend, right? There's no vertices in there to manipulate. So the first thing you're going to want to make sure is that if you are doing an organic model, a model that has to bend like a human, right? Like if you have an elbow, right? You need enough mesh in that elbow area to let your object deform, right? If your arm is just made up of like one edge loop at the shoulder, one edge loop at the elbow, one edge loop at the wrist, then your arm is going to collapse when it bends. So you may have to go back, that's one of the reasons I say you may have to rig this more than once. You may get your skeleton in here and start deforming it and stuff's going to collapse. And what you'll have to do is go back and do a little bit more work on the model and come back and rig it again. So that's not a failing on your part. That's just the learning process. That happens to everybody. It's kind of like, consider this first round your test of how you're going to skin this model. Well, the deformer we're going to be using today is not a bend deformer. And I'm sure that many of you have been curious, like are we just going to throw bend deformers all over our character to make it bend in the way we want it to? We're actually going to use a very specific kind of deformer that's more than a deformer. It's a whole rigging tool set, kind of. So under our drop-down menu where we're in modeling, we're going to go down to rigging. And you're going to see a couple of different sections we're going to be using up here at the top. Skeleton and skin. These are the two things that we're going to be using. So I'm just going to go into my front view just so I can show you here a little more clearly. Actually, I'm going to delete this one. Maybe not delete it. Maybe I'll move it over here. Zero this one back out. So under skeleton, you're going to see the option to create joints. So recognize that Maya doesn't know what your model is right now, right? It could be a rock, or it could be a human being, or it could be a jet airplane, it could be whatever. Maya doesn't know. It's just a bunch of faces to Maya, right? So it has no way of knowing where or how you want this thing to deform, right? And when it comes to something really complex, like an organism, like a human or a creature or any sort of thing like that, there's not just one place it bends. It bends in multiple different places. And because of that, there are different dependencies on those deformations, right? So, like the location of my hand is completely driven by the location or the orientation of my shoulder, right? If I rotate my shoulder, my hand is kind of forced to go with it. It's dependent on that, right? Just like the position of my hand is completely dependent on the location of my hips. Right? If I move my hips over here, my hand goes with it. And because of that, so that sort of dependency we call a hierarchy. I know we've kind of talked about that a little bit, but what we're going to create here is a joint hierarchy or a joint chain. Right? So the thing we're creating is like indicators or ways of telling Maya this is where we would want our model to bend, right? Where we would want our model to have a hinge or a deformation point, right? So if I just go to create joints, I can start laying those out. So the same way I drew that leg earlier, imagine I'm doing it here. Hip, knee, ankle, ball, toe, right? And what I have here, since I created it from the top down, is a very similar hierarchy to an actual leg skeleton, right? And if I rotate this, just like my hip, if I rotate at my hip, my knee and my ankle and my toe and everything go with it. And then if I rotate at my knee, my foot goes with it, right? So I can start creating a hierarchy that works very similar to our own skeleton, okay? In fact, in a lot of programs, Maya calls these joints. A lot of other programs call these bones. So we're building a virtual skeleton out of these objects. So the interesting thing is that that's not just a series of pivot points. Each of those things is its own deformer. Okay, so let's go ahead and put a couple of skeleton joints inside of our original mesh here. So if I go to skeleton, create joints, you're going to want to start from the topmost point of your hierarchy. So if this is an arm, like that's connected to a shoulder, then maybe I would start from the top and go down, right? If this were a pole that is planted in the ground, maybe I would start from the bottom and go up. Let's try that one. So I'm going to start down here at the bottom, pretty much in the center, right? And if I hit 4, you can kind of see where I'm putting these joints. If I hold shift, I can put it vertically. It won't go from side to side. And so I can just add a couple of these while holding shift and hit enter. And you see that I get a joint chain. That's kind of hard to see inside of there, but we get a joint chain inside of this object. Over here in our outliner, if I expand this, you'll see that all it is a series of joints that are parented underneath each other. So every time I click one, it adds another one to the hierarchy. I wish you could see that better. Is it Shift B? Is that the one that does the background? Control B? No. What is that? I can't remember that. There's a shortcut key for, there it is, Alt B. Is that a little bit better? Let's turn off my grid too, maybe that'll help. So, so you can kind of see this a little bit better now, like the chain is here. And for each of these, if I select joint 1, right, it looks like the entire thing is selected, but really just joint 1 is selected. And if I rotate it, it'll bend like this, right? And if I select joint 2, it'll bend like this, right? So I have this ability to bend this object all the way down the chain. But you'll notice that when I did that, nothing really... I'm just trying to find one where you can actually see it. For some reason this is feeling very faint to me. But you'll notice that when I do that, it's not actually affecting this mesh, right? One of the ways I can do this maybe is to set this under shading. We can do X-ray joints, and you'll be able to see the joints through the object. So hopefully that's a little bit better. So all we have right now is just a hierarchy chain. Like, this isn't really beneficial in any way because these don't even render, right? If I were to render this, we wouldn't see any of those joints. It's not useful in in terms of rigging until we make it deform the object or make it deform an object, right? So with this skeleton selected, I can just choose the first joint, hold down Shift and select the mesh, and then under Skin, I can choose Bind Skin. Now, before let's just go ahead and click that and see what we get. Okay, it looks like nothing happened, except for you may notice that my joints are sort of a different color now. Like they have sort of like a gradient of color up the joint chain. And if I select one of those and start deforming it, you'll see that now these joints manipulate this object at specific points. Okay? So this is really the basis of almost all major rigging that you're ever going to work with. Most creatures, animals, humans, whatever, if it's an organic thing, more than likely most of your deformation is going to come from some form of skeletal rig. Okay? It's more diverse because we can actually have multiple chains of things coming off of this, right? If I wanted to create another skeleton, I can create joints. I can do something like this. And then I can go back. I can hit Enter to finish that up. Go back and create another skeleton. Choose this joint and start building a chain from there. All right. I can go back and do it again. Choose this joint. Choose this joint. Start building a chain from there. So this hierarchy can get really complicated, right? I can build whatever organic structure or organic thing I need, and then use these to deform our object. On top of that, there's one more really neat thing about this, and I'll show you this just kind of quickly. We're going to use that in a minute. Is if I build a joint chain that already has a bend in it, let's say this, right? We have the ability to rotate to get this movement, right? But we also have the ability to add some other controllers to this. So the one I'm going to use, if I go to skeleton, it's going to be create IK handle. So I'll talk about what IK means here in just a second, but first let's look at what it does. So if I create an IK handle and I click my top joint first and my bottom joint last, you'll see it draws a line between the two. And now if I select that IK handle and move it, it will kind of keep it all as one system. So I really just have to animate this one point to get a series of deformations. So how many of you want to take a guess at what IK stands for? Anybody? Yeah, it's not something intuitive. So when we're talking about a joint chain that rotates from the top down the hierarchy, we call that forward kinematics. Okay, so my arm is a good example. It's just flailing around willy-nilly, right? And how that happens is it rotates from my shoulder first, and then my elbow, and then my wrist. Right? And so to get my wrist at my hand at any given point, I have to rotate down the hierarchy, right? If I want to get my wrist down to my side, I have to rotate my shoulder down, my elbow down, my wrist down, right? So that's forward kinematics. It's going forward down the hierarchy. Inverse kinematics means the end of the hierarchy, or IK means inverse kinematics, which means the end of the hierarchy is what is controlling that, right? This last joint in the chain here is the wrist, but if I grab this IK handle on the wrist, I can use the wrist to place this wherever I want. And the reason that's useful is because if this is the shoulder, and I move, oh, wait, forgot to set this. Under attribute editors, I have to set stickiness to on. I get sticky. So the reason this is useful is because if I grab my shoulder, my hand can stay locked in a certain location. Okay? So there's reasons for both of these. If I'm needing to just gesture around, FK works better. But if I need my hand to lock to something and stay in that location, it needs to be an IK so it will stay locked to that orientation, right? Otherwise, you would constantly have to counter animate that. Now, the reason I tell you this is because your character has 2 feet, and those 2 feet are almost always locked to the floor, right? With the exception of the time when they're picking up for a step, right? You want your feet to stay on the floor when you put them on the floor, right? So if you move your character's hips, you don't want their feet going to the floor and then you having to bend their knee to get their foot back up on the floor, right? You just want to be able to put their foot on the floor and then move the rest of the character around and the foot will stay. And so that's one of the reasons we're going to use this. So all of this stuff is confusing. Like it gets very overwhelming. And this is just sort of the beginning of rigging. That's why there's a whole class for this. Some of you are going to just, what's the phrase? I'm trying to find a good phrase. Anyway, just like go for it and just figure it out, just work through it. And you're maybe not going to enjoy the rigging part of this as much, but you'll just get through it. And that's kind of how some people are. Some of you, halfway through this, are going to realize that you really enjoy this. We have a whole class for rigging. It's called Technical Direction. And if you're a problem solver and maybe are okay with doing a little scripting every now and then, Technical Direction is going to be one of those things that you likely kind of gravitate toward. So, all right, to our robot. So creating the hierarchy for this isn't actually that complicated. All we have, at least for my character, all I have is sort of the main body. I'm going to call that the hips or the root. Some people call it the center of gravity, right? That needs to be able to bend around and look around and rotate, right? I need a hip for each leg. I need a knee for each leg. And I need an ankle for each leg. Right? I need something to bend here at the ankle. And then I need a toe joint because I would like to be able to wiggle my toe around, because when my character walks, when they take a step forward, they're going to roll forward on the ball of their foot, and I want to be able to animate the toe staying flat on the ground, right? So it doesn't feel like the toe is going to the floor. So really, when we look at it that way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, so about 9 joints is all this is really going to need. How we create those, we need to do it in kind of a controlled way, but just so we don't rigging is one of those things that if you create something kind of slightly off, sometimes that can have an effect further down the process. So a couple of things for you to check for. On mine, I try to set mine up where in the side view, my character's knee has just a little bit of bend in it. Just naturally, it doesn't have to be much at all. It can be very, very slightly. Or maybe yours doesn't have any bend in it, but when you create your joint, you put just a little bit of bend in the joint. Right? So I do that just because that way, when I put in that skeleton, the IK system will know which way for my leg to bend. I don't want it to bend backwards. Right? You'll also notice that I've got enough deformation in here, enough information of enough joints in here, not joints, enough spans in here or edge loops in here for this object to deform smoothly. This is the only one that really is going to deform the mesh. The rest of these, I'm pretty much just going to have the joint deform the entire object. Okay, so we'll talk about that once I get going here. A couple of other things that will probably make this easier for you. Having your character at 0, 0, 0, so at the origin point, meaning everything sort of lines up vertically if I go to the front view here, everything sort of lines up vertically along that axis line. And then I went ahead and raised my character's feet up to the x-axis. The last thing you probably should do before we go any further is you want to UV unwrap this object before you skin it. It doesn't mean you have to do it right now. We can go ahead and create the skeleton. We can actually create the whole rig. But before we skin that rig, or before we skin that skeleton to the mesh, you want to make sure you've done all of your UV work. The reason for that is Maya is going to consider the order in which you do these things. And if you put a UV unwrap node on top of the skin node, Maya will move it first and then calculate the UVs afterwards. So what that's going to do is it's going to cause your texture map to seem like it's sort of crawling all over your model. So we want to make sure we've UV unwrapped it before we do any skinning to this. The very last thing, and this one is really, really important, so if you happen to be watching a YouTube video or sleeping, you maybe should pay attention to this part. Select the entire model and do Edit, Delete by Type, History. The reason for that is you've been modeling on this for days. There's a good chance you have this giant list of history in there that is going to either slow down Maya or cause it to crash obsessively, right? Deleting history at this point is really, really important. I usually also freeze my transformations just in case I've scaled a bunch of stuff. Did you have a question? Or I didn't know if you read. Okay. So delete by type, history, and then modify, freeze transformations. Some of you are going to have issues with this. If you forget to do this, I'm sorry, the only real answer, no matter how much skinning you've done, is to delete the skin and delete your history and reskin it. And after you've skinned for a little while, you'll see why that's frustrating. So, but once you've done this, Maya is going to pretty much think of this as a new object. Okay? All right. We're going to go ahead and start making a skeleton for this. I'm going to do it in a way that may not immediately make sense to you, because you would think that what I would want to do is just from this front view, go in here and just start, go in here and just start like creating skeleton stuff like this, right? But I want to be very clean with these. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in my side view, and this seems weird. The reason I want to do this is because I want this knee to be perfectly straight with the correct bend in it when I create it. Okay, so I'm going to make sure this is open. I'm going to create my root joint first. So this is the character's hips, right? And then, or the character's center of gravity. Right? And then I'm going to create the hip joint. So we're going to create a joint any place that we think we need to be able to bend our character, okay? We want to do as few as possible, but enough to get the deformation that we need, right? So my hip joint, I'm going to go in here and make sure I'm kind of getting this in a reasonable spot. I can hit 4, sort of see where my edge loops are. Right about there feels like the center of the bend to me. Go. So my knee. Now, where I want my ankle to bend, for me, I want it to bend at the bottom of this hose because I want this piece of metal here to feel solid. I don't want it to feel like it's squishy, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put my ankle joint right there. And so you'll see what I'm talking about. I'm already getting a little bit of natural bend in this knee. I don't really need one here. Right? Like I know that sort of my instinct would be to go like here to the ground and then forward. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go forward to the toe at the location I want the toe to bend. And really, in theory, that's the last one I need. But I usually add one more out here on the end just so I can see sort of what the end of the toe is doing. Right? And I'm not really even going to scan anything to that one. That one's just there for visualization purposes for me. Once I get all this done, I'm going to hit enter. Now, I'm going to just throw this out there because everybody probably modeled their character to a different scale. Some of you, your joints may seem like beach balls. Some of them, they may seem like little bitty tiny needles, right? All of that is based off of your scene's scale. If yours is feeling like, if these joints that you're creating here are feeling like they're the wrong size, there's not really a size to them. That's just how they're being displayed in the viewport. We can change that just by going to display. Bless you. Goodness gracious. Bless you. Go to display, animation, and then on animation, joint size. And then we can just scale this up and down to make our joints whatever size makes most sense for you. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and leave mine at 1. It feels okay at that. So. Okay. Now from this angle, it looks like everything is fine. Yes?
How did you get to the joint display?
Under display menu, and then animation, and then joint size. Ashley, did you have a question too, or was it the same question? All right. Gotcha. Okay, so from this angle, it looks like everything's hunky-dory, right? Until I go to my perspective view and realize that for some reason, it created my joint over there. I'm honestly not sure why it created it right there. Probably because I don't know. So that's not where I want it, right? Really, I would want this to be at 0 in my translate X. I don't know why. Usually it would create it at 0. But even if I created it at 0 on my translate X, right, that leg is not in the right place, right? That leg is like straight down the center, and that's why this doesn't seem like the most intuitive way to create this from the side. Here's why I did it. The more I manipulate these joints, the more it can make little things mess up, right? So if I were to have created this from the front, I would have had to move a whole bunch of different joints just to get it in place in the side view, right? If I would have created it straight up and down, I would have had to move like almost every joint in the side view to get it in the right place there. Instead, now in the front view, all I have to do is move this over to the side. And I'll probably go ahead and go to my front view just so I can sort of see that lining up well enough. And now everything is pretty clean. What I'm really aiming for is as few numbers in my channel box as possible, right? I want this to be as close to a new object as possible. Okay. All right. Now we're going to do something now that some of you are going to think is a little bit of a waste of time. I promise you it's not. I'm going to open up all of these joints in my outliner, and I'm going to name them. In fact, you'll notice that everything in my scene is named. I recognize that there is so much I'm throwing at you in this class that for me to be a stickler on naming everything just seems like I'm being overly organized or something. That's not really the case. As you may have noticed in your breakfast scene, your outliner turns into a mess very quickly, right? It's going to get even messier when you are trying to remember, is joint 4 your elbow or your ankle or your knee, right? I honestly don't even remember. Let's click on it and see. It's your ankle. Okay. Later, we're going to have to refer to these a lot, right? So I'm going to name them now. Not only am I going to name them, I'm going to name which side of the body they're on. I use it, when I name this, I always do it from the character's perspective because I can be looking at the character from the front or the back. So that's the character's left leg, right? he or she would consider this her left leg, right? So I'm going to name these. This top one I will name root, because this is sort of the origin of all of the joint hierarchy, right? And then joint 2, I'm going to do L underscore hip. Okay. I'm just going to go down the chain here and just do that. L underscore ankle. L. That's not ankle, that's the knee. And then I always name this last one L toe, L underscore toe end. I'm actually not even going to put any skin weights on that. That's just there so when I rotate, let me show you this. When I rotate toe, I can see what happens to toe end, right? That would still work if toe wasn't there. If I were rotating this, it's still rotating. I just can't see the result of it. So I go ahead and add that toe end just so I can see what's happening there. It just makes it a little clearer in my head. So I have my entire left side. And as some of you have maybe already recognized, you probably, it's way easier in Maya to just do one side of something and then duplicate it over or mirror it over, right? We've kind of figured that out all the way from the beginning when we were doing the bridge, right? Our bridge was very symmetrical. Most things in the world that are created or alive are symmetrical in some way, right? So I'm just going to mirror this entire leg across. Recognize I don't need another copy of my root. I just need everything from the hip down, right? And I just need a right version of that. Now I could just hit Control D from there, and it would actually it would duplicate that whole chain, and then I could just move that over. And there's nothing really wrong with that, except for there's just an easier way. What I'm going to do instead is select this hip, and I'm going to go to Skeleton, Mirror Joints, and then I'm going to choose my options box. Okay, so this is going to be a few different options we have to put in here. So it's asking which plane to mirror across. Not which axis, but which plane, right? So it needs, we're wanting our object to move in the x-axis. If we look down here at our little axis tool here, you'll realize that moving it in this direction is moving it in x, right? So I want it to mirror it toward the x-axis, which means the plane that I need to choose is the one that doesn't have x in it, right? It's the other two, which is the YZ, right? I'm also going to do a replace name, and that's why I named this the way I did. So I'm going to have this search for L underscore, and anytime it finds L underscore, I'm wanting it to replace it with R underscore. So one of the reasons I put the underscore in there is because if I just had it search for L and replace it, then when it mirrored it over, it would be my anchor, right, instead of my ankle. So having that underscore or a dash or something like that is an extra name convention that it can search for that won't mess up the rest of your naming, right? So every time it finds L underscore in my duplicate, it's going to replace it with R underscore. And so when I hit mirror, now I just have a whole separate leg in the correct place and all correctly named. Okay? I know that that's a lot of small steps, but this is the way you want it. This is very clean, right? Now, again, some of you may have more body parts on your character. You may have a spine. You may even have arms. If that's the case, you just need more joints now, right? That's not all you need, but that is the next step, is that you need more joints, right? If my character had like arms and a spine and a head and everything, I would just go in here from this point, create joints, select my root, hold down shift, and just start creating more joints up this way, and then maybe out through my arm or whatever, right? Mine doesn't need that, so this is really where I can stop. Right? I'm going to go ahead and save this just in case something crashes. Let's do. Okay. We're closer to done than you might think. So we have a skeleton, but right now it doesn't do anything. Right? We don't have to skin it right now, but I'm going to go ahead and skin mine just to show you how this works. I can always skin it and then detach the skin later. So to skin this, all I have to do is select the top root joint and all of the mesh parts. Right? And you can select these kind of in any order. I don't need those two things. So all of the parts of mesh and this skeleton. And once I skin this skeleton will hold all of these pieces together, right? Even though it's multiple pieces, this is why we don't have to model it in one big contiguous piece, right? It's because when I go to skin and bind skin, you'll see now that if I move just that root joint, the entire model goes with me, right? Now, ideally, everything would be perfect right now, and I could just start moving these things, and my character would just work, right? But that's not necessarily what's going to happen, right? It's going to, it's a program, right? Like it's going to do its best, but it's not smart. Like it's just running algorithms. I'm going to go back a few steps to before I skin this and show you that like there's some things we can do to get a slightly better result on this skin. And one of those is under the skinning options. So if we go to bind skin and go to our options, you'll see that the way it's going to try to do this is with joint hierarchy. So, with closest distance. So it's going to bind it to the joint hierarchy. If I only wanted to bind it to one joint, I could just say selected joints, and I could choose specifically which joints to skin it to. But I'm fine with joint hierarchy because I've just selected the top one. It's going to choose everything below it. The bind method right now is set to closest distance, right? So what that means is that since this part of the foot right here is closer to this ankle than it is to this knee, it will put some of the skin weight on that ankle. Right? So if I change that from closest distance to closest in hierarchy and hit bind skin, I'll get a little bit of a better skin weighting, right? It's still got a little bit of stuff messed up, but it's still a little bit better. There's also, I undid the skinning again. There's also a couple of others, and some of these will work well, some of them won't. Heat map works really well when it works, but it only seems to work about 10% of the time. Your model has to meet a whole lot of very specific requirements for it to work. All of the joints have to be completely inside of the model, and your model has to be what's called watertight, which means that there's no holes in it in any places. And so like the top and bottom of my character's legs have holes in it, so it's probably not going to work for me. I can try it. Worst case scenarios, it gives me a bunch of errors. It does take just a little bit longer to skin it. But when it works, heat mapping, yeah, that's what I thought. It's probably going to give me a whole bunch of those, actually. I'm probably going to regret clicking that. Yep, I am. So, the other one on the list was geodesic voxel. which just sounds like Maya's making up words, right? Basically, what that means is it's going to calculate the volume of your object, the same way it was using like the fluids to calculate stuff. Maya's going to do something similar to that. I wish I could cancel this. Mistake. Nothing. Okay. I feel like I learn this lesson every semester and then forget. So, oh, okay. So it finished. Did it? No, it didn't. Yeah, it did. And so the legs worked great, but the rest of it did not. So I'm guessing none of the rest of this stuff went with it. Just the head. So we could do this. We could keep this part and reskin those other parts if we wanted to. But just to show you how this will work, I'll go back to this point and skin, bind skin. This time I'm going to choose geodesic voxel and see what that gives me. That's not bad. So, so it looks like in this case, for me, geodesic voxel is getting me the best result. Okay. Now, there's still some stuff messed up. There will never be a case in your whole entire existence where you hit skin and everything works perfectly. Like, that's just not how this tool works. And so this next part is the part that a lot of people get really kind of frustrated with, which is making the skinning work correctly. Right? Again, we don't have to do this right now, but I'm going to go ahead and do, let me see what time it is. And this class ends at 8:05 or 8:15. I'm sorry, 10:05 or 10:15. 10:15. I'm not going to try to squeeze it in. We're just going to talk about skinning a little bit. And I may put in the IK, but probably not. And what we're going to do is we'll pick up the rest of this next class period. So in terms of skinning, all we have to do is change which joints are deforming which vertices. So all of the joints are deforming all of the objects in some way or another. What's actually happening, though, is for each of these vertices, there is a amount of influence from one or more of those joints, right? So, for example, if I sort of tumble around here to my ankle or to my knee, right, when I rotate my knee right here, you'll see that I'm getting sort of a little bit of bend in the middle here, right? It's not like a sharp line that is bending. It's sort of softer, right? So like this vertex here, for example, is being influenced partially by the hip joint and partially by the knee joint. And the way we can see that is if I select my object and right-click on it and go to Paint Skin Weights tool, it will bring up this tool here, and if I go down to my knee, you'll see that the area that is white is being controlled by the knee, and the area that is black is not. Right? So if I scroll out, you can see what's being controlled by the knee joint and what's not being controlled by the knee joint. So if I go out to my hip, you'll see that that area, the white area, is being controlled by the hip joint. And so you'll see that there's some gray area in between. Right? So when we're talking about painting skin weights, that's what we're talking about, is that I can go in here now and add more influence to the hip with this paintbrush. It's going to work just like the sculpting tool, so if I hold down B, I can make it bigger. If this did not pop up for you, your tool settings, it's this hammer up here in the top corner, top left-hand corner, right-hand corner, sorry. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a value of 1 to the hip joint that I have selected. So if I start selecting that, you'll see I can make that sort of control more of my leg. Right? Now, the mistake that some people will do is they'll say, I want less of this to be controlled by the hip, and they'll think that they can just paint a value of 0. You can. You can say, I no longer want that to be controlled by the hip, but then you're telling Maya, you decide what gets to control that. And Maya's going to make bad decisions. Maya is not a good decision maker. So what is the better way of doing that is if you want the ankle or the knee to control this part, you would go to the knee and add influence to that. Right. So again, this is the part that that I was more concerned about when I said model it as a robot. The reason for that is because all of this deformation I'm getting up here on the top part of the body is actually super easy to fix, right? I get all that like squash that's happening there on the head. The easy way to fix that is I just want the root to be the only thing that controls that. So if I select this and go to Paint Weight Tool and go to my root, you'll see that like some other things have influence on the body, right? But I just want it to be the root. So I'm going to set my value to 1 and just hit flood, and it will change my influence to the root for the entire object. Okay? So anything that is going to be solid like that, I can now fix in that way. Flood. Now, I'm doing something that's actually kind of bad practice, which is I moved my character's leg and then I left it that way. Don't do that. Like, let me go ahead and zero that out. And let me see if I can zero this out or if that's just going to mess it up. Oh, that worked. But you always want to be able to get your character back to the bind pose. So what I usually do is I will wiggle it around to see how the deformation works. And then I'll hit Control Z to get it back to its original location. So for all of these objects, I can just go through here now, paint skin weights, flood, paint skin weights, flood, my bow, paint skin weights, flood. And so now when I move this around, my bow is going to stay. When I move my hip, that part's moving around. I'm not for sure if I want that or not. I may flood those as well. Let's go ahead and do that. Now, my toe and my ankle are going to be another issue. So you'll notice that on my ankle, it's probably going to, it's kind of squashing a little bit, like right in the back there. And then when I rotate my toe, it's deforming my foot as well. So really, I just want this entire piece right here to be controlled by the ankle. So paint skin weights, choose my left ankle, flood. And I want this piece right here to be entirely controlled by the toe. So I'll hit flood. There we go. And then I could do the same over here with this one. Ankle. So again, the most difficult part of all of this is going to be areas like the knee, where I am not 100% sure which vertex needs to be controlled by which joint, and I'm going to have to do a little bit of painting skin weights. So an example of this is maybe I don't want it to collapse quite as much back here. I could paint some skin weights and add just a little bit more influence to the back of the hip. Now I don't have to paint a value of completely 1. I can add just a little bit. So if I go to add and just set this kind of lower, I can just add a little bit of influence back here in the back of the knee to kind of retain some of that volume when the leg bends, right? So it's going to be really subtle tweaking of your skin weights throughout this whole thing to get the deformation correct. Now, you don't have to skin yours yet. If you're still doing your UVs, that's fine. This step can actually come at the end. This just felt like something that we could kind of cover today and sort of get away with. The last thing I'll show you, one more thing, is you'll remember those IK handles we created? Well, right now, if I wanted my character to walk, and I grabbed the root and started moving my character forward, the feet go through the floor, right? So this is what that IK was for. Now, if my character was just flying through the air, like flailing away, right, that's fine. Right? I don't mind if they're flailing away. But when I want them to feel like they're locked to the floor, I need something to control the end of it. Okay. So what we're going to do for that is under Skeleton, create IK handle, and I'm going to go to my options box, and I'm going to make sure that sticky is checked. Now, if you forget to check this, you can always go back to the previous, like the attribute editor, and turn that on. But if I choose sticky, you'll see I have like a little crosshair here. I'm going to choose my character's hip, and then the ankle. Did I get that? Yeah, I think it did. And that should have created an IK handle now where I can move my character's leg around however I want. More importantly, though, is if I grab my character's hip, that foot sort of stays in place. Now, the toe's still going through the floor, which is a little bit of a problem, and that's some of what we're going to fix tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and create another IK handle for the other side. Move that. You'll see now both of the feet are kind of sticking. Okay. The last little bit of this is not super like I could do it really quickly, but it gets a little complicated. So I think this is where I'm going to stop. That gives you a little bit more time to kind of get caught up to this point if you're still finishing up your UVs and stuff like that. If you're following along, just go ahead and save it here. We'll pick that up on Wednesday. We're going to put what is left to do is we're going to put controllers on this. So there are some things that you'll need to control that's just going to be easier if it's all on one controller. So similar to how we put that bend deformer on that main controller for our bottle, we're going to do something like that for the feet and the toes. We're also going to set up some constraints so our foot doesn't go through the floor like that, so our foot will stay completely flat. And we're just going to kind of set it up to where you can animate this entire character with just 3 objects. Okay. After we've done that, we're going to do a walk cycle. I'll probably separate that out to a separate day. So I think probably what that'll be is a week from today. I will go through the walk cycle process, and so that gives you the rest of this week to kind of get your character rigged up. Gives you another week to animate it and get it rendered. And then after that, you're home free and you can sleep as late as you want. Maybe, I don't know. Any questions on any of this? Lots of questions on any of this? I'll go ahead and save this video, upload it to YouTube, so you can always kind of watch back through it. I think we'll probably have a little bit of work time next class period too. So, cool. Rest of class is yours.